Hello. Uh, so I just talked. Mm, I just talked to Adrian and his mom, and Adrian pointed out that I've been touching my face in all of these read aloud videos, and I am not supposed to do that. So thank you, Adrian. I'm going to try to set a better example. I do want to say I basically have not, almost never have left my house. So it's really important if you're out at the grocery store or something like that to never touch your face. That's the main thing that it's for, because you might end up getting some of the virus on your hands, and if you touch your face, then it can go into your nose or your mouth, get you sick. That's also why we have to wash our hands a lot, especially if we're out around other people. I think it is still important, even when you're at home by yourself or just with your family, to wash your hands a lot and to try to keep from touching your face. Though it's not as important as when you're out with a lot of people. So, I will try not to touch my face. And I'm going to wash my hands a lot. Maybe I'll wash my hands right after I get done with this read aloud. I have to itch my nose by doing that instead. Or I guess you can do this. I guess that's fine. If you have to itch your face or whatever, you can do that. Thank you, Adrian. Good advice. Chapter 14. At first, the others thought that Edward was a great, good joke. A rabbit, the hobos said, laughing. Let's chop him up and put him in the stew pot. Or when Bull sat with Edward carefully balanced on his knee, one of them would call out, Got yourself a little dolly, Bull? Edward, of course, felt a surge of anger at being referred to as a dolly. But Bull never got angry. He simply sat with Edward on his knee and said nothing. Soon, the men became accustomed to Edward, and word of his existence spread. So it was that when Bull and Lucy stepped up to a campfire in another town, another state, another place entirely, the men knew Edward and were glad to see him. Malone! They shouted in unison. And Edward felt a warm rush of pleasure at being recognized, at being known. Whatever it was that had begun in Nellie's kitchen, Edward's new and strange ability to sit very still and concentrate the whole of his being on the stories of another became invaluable around the hobo campfire. Look at Malone, said a man named Jack one evening. He's listening to every dang word. Certainly, said Bull. Of course he is. Later that night, Jack came and sat down next to Bull and asked if he could borrow the rabbit. Bull handed Edward over, and Jack sat with Edward upon his knee. He whispered in Edward's ear. Helen, Jack said, and Jack Jr. and Taffy. She's the baby. Those are my kids' names. They're all in North Carolina. You ever been to North Carolina? It's a pretty state. That's where they are. Helen, Jack Jr., Taffy. You remember their names, okay, Malone? After this, wherever Bull and Lucy and Edward went, some tramp would take Edward aside and whisper the names of his children in Edward's ear. Betty, Ted, Nancy, William, Jimmy, Eileen, Skipper, Faith. Edward knew what it was like to say over and over again the names of those you had left behind. He knew what it was like to miss someone, and so he listened. And in his listening, his heart opened wide, and then wider still. The rabbit stayed lost with Lucy and Bull for a long time. Almost 7 years passed, and in that time, Edward became an excellent tramp, happy to be on the road, restless when he was still. The sound of the wheels on the train tracks became a music that soothed him. He could have ridden the rails forever. But one night in a railroad yard in Memphis, as Lucy and Bull slept in an empty freight car and Edward kept watch, trouble arrived. A man entered the freight car and shone a flashlight in Bull's face, and then kicked him awake. "You bum," he said. "You dirty bum. I'm sick of you guys sleeping everywhere. This ain't no motel." Bull sat up slowly. Lucy started to bark. "Shut up," said the man. He delivered a swift kick to Lucy's side that made her yelp in surprise. All his life, Edward had known what he was. A rabbit made of china, a rabbit with bendable arms and legs and ears. He was bendable, though, only if he was in the hands of another. He could not move himself, and he had never regretted this more deeply than he did that night when he and Bull and Lucy were discovered in the empty rail car. Edward wanted to be able to defend Lucy, but he could do nothing. He could only lie there and wait. "Say something," said the man to Bull. Bull put his hands up in the air. He said, "We're lost." "Lost, ha, you bet you're lost." And then the man said, "What's this?" And he shone the light on Edward. "That's Malone," said Bull. "What the heck?" said the man. He poked at Edward with the toe of his boot. "Things are out of control. Things are out of hand. Not on my watch. No, sir, not when I'm in charge." The train suddenly lurched into motion. "No, sir," said the man again. He looked down at Edward. "No free rides for rabbits." He turned and flung open the door of the rail car, and then he turned back, and with one swift kick, he sent Edward sailing out into the darkness. The rabbit flew through the late spring air. From far behind him, he heard Lucy's anguished howl. "Ow! Ow!" she cried. Edward landed with a most alarming thump, and then he tumbled and tumbled and tumbled down a long, dirty hill. When he finally stopped moving, he was on his back, staring up at the night sky. The world was silent. He could not hear Lucy. He could not hear the train. Edward looked up at the stars. He started to say the names of the constellations, but then he stopped. "Bull," his heart said. "Lucy." How many times, Edward wondered, would he have to leave without getting the chance to say goodbye? A lone cricket started up a song. Edward listened. Something deep inside him ached. He wished that he could cry. I'm going to be right back. Chapter 15. In the morning, the sun rose, and the cricket song gave way to bird song, and an old woman came walking down the dirt road and tripped right over Edward. She said. She pushed at Edward with her fishing pole. Looks like a rabbit, she said. She put down her basket and bent and stared at Edward. Only he ain't real. She stood up. She said again. She rubbed her back. What I say is, there's a use for everything, and everything has its use. That's what I say. Edward didn't care what she said. The terrible ache he had felt the night before had gone away and had been replaced with a different feeling. One of hollowness and despair. Pick me up or don't pick me up, the rabbit thought. It makes no difference to me. The old lady picked him up. She bent him double and put him in her basket, which smelled of weeds and fish. And then she kept walking, swinging the basket and singing, "Nobody knows the troubles I've seen." Edward, in spite of himself, listened. I've seen troubles too, he thought. You bet I have. And apparently they aren't over yet. Edward was right. His troubles were not over. The old woman found a use for him. She hung him from a pole in her vegetable garden. She nailed his velvet ears to the wooden pole and stretched his arms out as if he were flying, and attached his paws to the pole by wrapping pieces of wire around them. In addition to Edward, pie tins hung from the pole. They clinked and clanked and shone in the morning sun. Can you tell what she's making him into? What use she's finding for him? Ain't a doubt in my mind that you can scare them off, the old lady said. Scare who off? Edward wondered. Birds, he soon discovered. Crows. They came flying at him, cawing and screeching, wheeling over his head, diving at his ears. Go on, Clyde, said the woman. She clapped her hands. You gotta act ferocious. Clyde. Edward felt a weariness so intense wash over him that he thought he might actually be able to sigh aloud. Would the world never tire of calling him by the wrong name? The old woman clapped her hands again. Get to work, Clyde, she said. Scare them birds off. And then she walked away from him, out of the garden and toward her small house. The birds were insistent. They flew around his head. They tugged at the loose threads in his sweater. One large crow in particular would not leave the rabbit alone. He perched on the pole and screamed a dark message in Edward's left ear. Caw, 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 without ceasing. As the sun rose higher and shone meaner and brighter, Edward became somewhat dazed. He mistook the large crow for Pellegrina. Go ahead, he thought. Turn me into a warthog if you want. I don't care. I'm done with caring. Caw, caw, said the Pellegrina crow. Finally the sun set and the birds flew away. Edward hung by his velvet ears and looked up at the night sky. He saw the stars. But for the first time in his life, he looked at them and felt no comfort. Instead, he felt mocked. You are down there alone, the stars seemed to say to him, and we are up here, in our constellations, together. I have been loved, Edward told the stars. So, said the stars, what difference does that make when you are all alone now? Edward could think of no answer to that question. Eventually, the sky lightened and the stars disappeared one by one. The birds returned, and the old woman came back to the garden. She brought a boy with her. Okay. The question for these two chapters, which you can either talk with your family about. You could post on Parlay. That would be the best way to do it, if you can. Post on Parlay an answer to this question. Or you could upload a Flipgrid video with answering the question. Or we might have time to talk about it during the Zoom meeting today, though I doubt that y'all will have watched this read aloud by that time, or most of you. So, talk with your family, post on Parlay, or post a Flipgrid video to answer the question I'm about to read. This question actually comes from the back of the book, which I thought was pretty cool. When the old woman uses Edward as a scarecrow, he feels mocked by the stars, which seem to say, "You are down there alone." When he tells the stars, "I have been loved," they reply, "What difference does that make when you're all alone now?" What do you think? Does being loved change the way that loneliness is felt? Yes or no? And if it does, in what way? How does it change how loneliness is felt? To know that you are loved and have been loved. Bye. Love y'all.